Over the course of my studies in theoretical physics, I've traveled across the continent and around the world sampling new ideas and tasting different answers to the questions of how and of why. And still, I find there remains a deep hunger which lives within me, a burning desire to share these great ideas with the people around me. And so, I have assembled a team of some of the greatest, most lucid, most creative minds I've encountered in my travels. And I call them my Titanium Physicists. You're listening to the Titanium Physicist Podcast, and I'm Ben Tippett. And now, allez, physique! On July 4th, 2012, scientists at the Large Hadron Collider announced that they'd probably detected a particle called the Higgs boson. This was big news. Big news for the politicians who'd spent billions on the Large Hadron Collider for the express purpose of finding the Higgs boson. Big news for the media because the Higgs boson is popularly referred to as the God particle, and the God particle discovered by physicists is a wonderful headline, and it was big news for particle physicists. See, the current working theory for particle physics is called the Standard Model. And in the Standard Model, there's a zoo of different elementary particles. Imagine yourself in a zoo. There are electrons in the zoo, and muons, and quarks, and neutrinos. Anyway. So the last empty cage in the zoo was for this Higgs boson, and finding it and filling the last cage was a triumph of the theory behind the Standard Model. So good work, everyone. Anyway, the deal with the Higgs boson is that it tells us that something called the Higgs field exists, the same way that sound waves tell us that air exists. And this thing called the Higgs field is important. It gives us mass. But how? How? Now that the hoopla has died down, it's time for my Titanium Physicist to take a crack at it. Today's topic is the Higgs mechanism. So, there were two problems with the explanation of the Higgs boson, which I've heard. The first is that everybody wants their explanation to last about a minute. Well, sucks to that, because we're going to explain it over many minutes. The second is that the explanations are always aimed at the stupidest people in the world. I'm not sure why, but the people writing the explanations always imagine a 5-year-old boy reading it and shaking his head, and that makes the writer really sad. So, sucks to that too. We're going to aim our explanations at the smartest man in the world. Now, our guest today wears many hats. He's a celebrity in many different spheres. Old people might remember him from the improvisation TV show Whose Line Is It Anyway? Young adult nerds might remember him as the voice of the two-headed announcer from the pod race from Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And those of you who are American babies might know him as the voice of Bob the Builder. But those of you in the know who listen to podcasts might know him as the host of the amazing hit podcast, The Smartest Man in the World. It's Greg Proops. Hi, Greg.
Hi, how are you, Ben?
I'm good.
Old people? Really?
I'm getting there. Anyway. It was in the
Old
90s.
people.
Come on.
It was in the 2000s. And don't be a weenus.
Okay, so Greg, for you today, I've assembled for you two of my finest Titanium physicists. Here they are. Arise, Matt Buckley. Dr. Matthew got his PhD in theoretical physics from the University of California, Berkeley in 2008. He studies dark matter and LHC collider phenomenology. He's currently employed at Fermilab as the David Schramm Fellow in Astrophysics. Now arise, Tia Miceli.
Boing, 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 boing.
Nice. Tia is a graduate student at the University of California, Davis, where she studies high-energy experimental particle physics, and she's writing her thesis on Z decays. Okay, Greg, you know what magnets are, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm aware of the concept of magnets.
You're aware of electricity and electrons and electric
Certainly.
charge. Okay.
Yes.
So magnets and electrons and electrical generators and static electricity, they all fall under the same theory of a particular force called the electromagnetic field. So we've understood electromagnetism for at least 100 years now. It was in the late 1800s where we put it all together. Starting in the early 1900s, people started playing with radioactivity and investigating radioactivity. So you have these atoms. In the center of atoms, in the nuclei, there are protons and neutrons, and they're all stuck together. And sometimes they fall apart, and you get a radioactive decay. The reason for that is that there's a force inside the atom called the weak force, and essentially it means that all of these nucleons, these protons and neutrons, are pushing against each other, and occasionally they push against each other hard enough in such a way that the atom crumbles. So in the last 100 years, people have been studying what makes this happen. Specifically, we've been studying the particularities of this weak force. So we know a few things about it. One of them is that it's really weak. There are three other forces, one called the strong force, which binds all the nucleons together, the electromagnetic force. Both of those are much stronger than this weak force. The weak force only really pokes up its head when it causes very large nuclei to fall to pieces. When we start to talk about quantum mechanics, we talk about how different objects interact with each other at really, really small scales. So it's like you zoom in and it's scales that are smaller than an atom. And it turns out that on these really small scales, when two electrons are pushing against each other, we can describe them pushing against each other as sending back and forth little particles. So instead of this great big electromagnetic force, we're describing it in very small terms as two electrons. They send these particles, called photons, back and forth. They're particles of light. Essentially, one electron sitting on your right hand, one electron sitting on your left hand. They send photons back and forth, and the photons say, hey, buddy, why don't you take a walk? And then they move apart. So we talk about this particle as mediating the force. So instead of a force field, we talk about two particles interacting with each other by exchanging a particle. It's kind of like...
So when they have this dialogue that you just described, I assume it's a highly charged atmosphere, and yet your delivery of it was, hey, buddy, take a walk.
So you can imagine like a proton picks up a photon and throws it at an electron. And when the electron gets hit, it gets told to move away, right? So it's literally being bombarded with things to tell it to move in a particular direction. So it's not a polite conversation.
Well, when you say it's told, isn't it a natural response to the electromagnetism involved in the situation? That's why it shoots away?
Yeah, that is what electromagnetism is. It's particles throwing photons at each other.
All right.
Conversation is perhaps the polite way of putting it. The nice way.
I understand. And so now we're at this point.
So the principal idea here is that at the really small scale, we're not talking about forces. It's like you said, we're talking about an interplay. There are these little particles that act as messengers, little quantum messengers between the two big particles, and those tell them what to do, right? So you get two electrons, each one sends a little messenger to the other guy telling him to get lost, and then they both move apart. So the deal is that this description of how forces work at the very, very microscopic works for more than just the electromagnetic. It turns out that it also works for, say, the weak interaction.
So the reason that we care about electromagnetism, we've known about it since forever, basically, is that it can act over huge distances, right? I mean, you can use a magnet to pick up a piece of metal, right? And that doesn't seem very impressive usually if you're playing with it on your table, but you remember you're picking up that small object with another small object and you're overcoming the mass of this giant planet, right? It's a really amazingly powerful force if you think of it like that. And the reason that it can do that is that the things that it's throwing back and forth, these little photons, are massless. They can go forever, basically. And that makes it so you can kind of conjure up a little photon and throw it to another particle. And that other particle can, get hit by the photon and move in the way that it's supposed to move. The weak force is so incredibly weak. The reason that we don't see it, interacting on our day-to-day life is because the particles that it's throwing back and forth to tell other particles how to move are really, really heavy. For scale, they're like 80 to 90 times heavier than a proton, heavier than whole atoms of elements, actually. And so you kind of have to conjure up a huge amount of energy to create a particle that you're going to throw to moderate the weak force. And so it's really, really difficult. It can't move that far because you have to kind of borrow this energy, throw it some distance, and that makes the weak force really, really weak.
So it's like if I'm trying to get my buddy electron to move over there, I can text message him and tell him to move. That text message would be like a photon. But if I want him to move using the weak force, then it would be like throwing a truck at him.
Why don't you offer to buy him a coffee or, like a aperitif or something and maybe sit down? There's all this violent chucking, and I just feel like if we're going to get a photon, a Higgs boson particle that we need to work with here, it's going to have to not just be a vengeful God, but also a benign God that understands that,
So the idea here is that the distance scale that you can use the weak force is much less than the distance scale that the electromagnetic force operates on. Pretty much if you get two particles far enough away from each other, they no longer feel the weak force. And they came up with a really fun explanation. Are you familiar with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Greg?
I'm modestly familiar with it. It's just, to me, when you describe it as a fun explanation? That perhaps fun is a subjective term?
Fun is always a subjective term.
And that one person's fun is another person's, water torture. But I'm willing to hear you out. So surmise me of the uncertainty principle.
Fundamentally, everybody describes the uncertainty principle as saying that you can't know a particle's momentum and location at the same time. And so there's limits on how much information you can extract from a particle. But there is another way to look at Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. One of them involves looking at energy. So you can tell how much energy a particle has, but not the time scale that it's living at. And so what happens is, essentially, you can say, hey, what if you make a particle and it's really, really heavy? The consequence of that might be that the particle ends up being really, really short-lived. So the explanation for why the weak force is so weak, in essence, is that the particles that mediate the force, the little messengers going back between two nucleons, are really heavy, and so they're short-lived, because we want them to be short-lived, because then they can't go very far in that short amount of time. So this was the brilliant deduction that they made.
Have we come to the fun part yet, or are we
All right,
still
okay, here's the fun part.
idling before we get to the fun solution?
So I want you to imagine these force-mediating particles as messengers between my house and various other houses around town. So the photon is like a little kid on a bike, right? They've got so much energy. You just say, hey, ride across town and tell the Johnsons that their dog sucks. And they will, and it's really easy. They can just go and go and go.
Do you think it's a little ethnocentric to presume it's the Johnsons? I mean,
well, I don't know. What
it could be the Verenders or the Gonzales or the Leclercs, the Washingtons. I mean,
so then I want to talk.
So you live in like this white people town and picket fences. Your photons are
apparently he's
Romney supporters, is what I'm getting at here. Your photons are. All right, go on.
All right, so I want to talk to my friends, the Chans, as well.
So you're going to send one of your messengers over,
right. But my messenger is one of these weak force messengers.
Therefore, a heavy one and short-lived, but it can't
really
get
heavy.
Very far.
He gets halfway down the block and collapses.
Mm-hmm.
So they never get the message. So that is the fun description of essentially why the weak force is so weak. Essentially, all of its force mediators are really heavy, so they die off too quickly to exchange the messages, whereas I can send these little kids on bikes pretty much anywhere in town, and the message will still get through.
I don't know about the fun aspect of it is a little, for me, I understand why kids on bikes are fun.
They're fun.
It was the Johnson thing that really tripped me out, I guess. I just turned into a Shirley Jackson story there all of a sudden. I prefer that messengers from another universe break through the fabric of space and time and intervene in man's machinations because of their own evil guiding principles that we are not privy to.
Are you talking about Romney?
I looked for those at CMS. We didn't find them.
I'm not saying mine is based on any hard facts or research or even a fun theory. It's just something I like to think about. I mean, it's not as pertinent as it might be to this conversation, but since kids on bikes were going to be fun, I thought I'd take fun into a kind of a H.P. Lovecraft area here. And anyway, so now we've got the slow, heavy particles, and we've got the children sending photon messages on bikes. How does my Higgs boson guard particle enter into the mix here?
Yeah, good question. So here's the deal. Nobody knew why the fat, heavy particles were so fat and heavy. When they wrote out the equations, they saw that the equations only made sense if this weak mediator was massless. So all these weak messages should be delivered by little kids on bikes, just like the other one. And so the mystery was, how did it get so heavy? And the answer is, these guys came up with a theory that said there's this field called the Higgs field, in essence. Higgs field sticking to the heavy guy is what makes him so heavy.
All right.
So that's how it all comes together. Now we're talking about the Higgs field.
Well, is it called the God particle because it's part of the last piece of a puzzle of the fabric of the universe that was hitherto explained? Or is it called a God particle because, in essence, now you found something that can actually control matter and is integral to...
It's called the goddamn particle.
Yeah, it's the goddamn particle.
Because Leon Letterman at Fermilab was really annoyed at how hard it was to find, and the press wouldn't print the full name.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. How come that wasn't in the paper? That was much funnier. The God particle makes it sound like it's going to come to your house and make some decisions or whatever.
No.
Like smote you with rain and ants and, fire, like ancient Egypt or whatnot. Like that musical, the Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat and whatever. My God is an angry God, an vengeful God. I mean, if you're that kind of person. But then I'm from San Francisco, so my God is a Filipino lesbian girl with piercings, and it's much different and more fun.
Well, I'm sure we come up with some way to destroy the universe with the Higgs, but, that's probably...
Well, I remember cold fusion years ago, and what a disappointment it was that it actually never really happened, and that it just basically turned into cold filtering and made beer kind of watery.
Give us another century. We'll see what we can do about that.
Oh, okay. Hey, you can have all the time you like. Just understand that time is a concept invented by corporations to make people feel bad about themselves.
That's unphysical, Greg Proops. I liked all the stuff from another universe, but you can't go saying time doesn't exist around me. That don't cut it.
All the news that came out for the Higgs said that the Higgs gives everything mass, right? To describe any of this, you have to kind of have a picture of what mass means, right? I mean, we talk about it, but for physicists, it kind of has specific meanings that doesn't necessarily translate into what non-physics thinks about it. Mass is the thing that prevents you from going at the speed of light. Einstein, way back at some decade that...
1905.
Nice.
Wow.
Yeah.
He is the smartest man in the world.
So, in 1905, Einstein understood that nothing can travel faster than light. Anything that has mass can't travel at the speed of light, and anything that's massless can never travel at anything other than the speed of light. And so what we think about mass is that it's the property that we have that prevents us from zipping around always at the same speed. It allows us to kind of take a rest and not move at the speed of light. And so that's one way to think about mass, and that's actually kind of the way that when we're talking about this Higgs particle giving mass to particles, that's what we mean. It's allowing things to travel slower than light. And kind of weirdly, then this always gets overlooked in the newspapers. It doesn't give all of the mass in the universe. You and I and the things around us are made out of atoms, and those atoms, most of their mass comes from a completely different mechanism. But the fundamental particles, the things like electrons, all of their mass comes from this Higgs mechanism. And so without them, the electrons would be massless. And if we had massless electrons, we'd all dissolve into a sea of charged particles, and it would be a very boring universe. So the Higgs is very important in that sense. It gives us the ability to be around. And if we want to explain what does it mean when we say it gives mass, we're saying how does the Higgs prevent us from moving at the speed of light? So... The analogy that people often use, and it's not the most perfect analogy, but I guess it's a place to start, is that there's this field in the universe. It's the Higgs field. And every particle, photons and electrons and quarks and everything out there has a field, right? And a particle is just kind of an excitation of the field. You put enough energy into a little area, and then the magic quantum mechanics means that that little lump of energy moves around like a particle. And
so another way to think about that is sound. The air around you is a field. And then when you clap your hands, you create this disturbance in the air and you get this wave that's very short. And that is like a particle. So it's a quantum of air.
Yeah. So there's just these kind of fundamental objects are these fields. You can just kind of make little excitations out of them. Those are particles. They're just, wandering around. And there's many different types. And one of them is this particular field, the Higgs field. And it just has this property that as other particles move around, they feel the presence of the Higgs field. And it prevents them from moving as fast as they would. And the analogy that people would use is a cocktail party. And the background field, in this case, the Higgs field, is just everyone sitting at the cocktail party. And they're just kind of evenly distributed around the room, and they're talking to each other. And then a very famous physicist walks in. Albert Einstein walks in. We're all very surprised that he's back from the dead.
This is where my theory about the ectoplasm from another universe coming in and manifesting itself by reanimating people who are necessary. But go on. So Albert Einstein walks into a cocktail party. It wouldn't be Newton, because I don't think he drank.
If the cocktail party was just an empty room, then, Albert Einstein could get from the left side of the room to the right side very, very quickly. He could just walk across, right? Nothing would interrupt him. But because it's filled with this background field of physicists, when he walks in, everyone around him kind of rushes up towards him to have a conversation.
Well, I should hope so.
Most of the people would go up to talk to him. And as he tries to move through the room, this field kind of surrounding him, right, this excitation prevents him from moving as fast as he would. So we would see him moving slower than we might expect if the room was empty. To make the analogy, he is a particle that has just walked to this Higgs field, and he's moving slower than he should be, and so we say he has mass. And so that's one way to think of what the interaction between the Higgs and another field is. It's kind of preventing things from moving as fast as they would. If I walk into a cocktail party, I am nowhere near Albert Einstein, so not as many people would come over to talk to me, so I'd be able to move around the room faster. So I would seem to be lighter than Albert Einstein, right, by this analogy.
But what if I was a child on a bike?
You'd probably cause a lot of damage.
All right, go on.
If you throw a little kid in and tell him to get from point A to point B in this room, he can kind of zip around everyone and get through. And there are particles that don't see the field, and they're massless still, things like photons. They just zip through the room from point A to point B.
Really, though, are there any particles so blind as those that will not see the field?
The ones we see with, actually.
I see.
Are you understanding everything that Matt is saying? Do you have any questions?
I'm giving it the old college try. Now, mind you, I went to a junior college, and you guys are, doctors. But my best friend in England is a doctor in physics, so I think that has to count for something.
It does. It counts for a lot. Physicists only talk to people that other physicists know.
I see.
That's true.
So we're at a cocktail party, and everybody's rushing toward dead Albert Einstein. And your analogy is that some particles are rushing toward him, some particles are rushing away. We're still trying to gather mass here.
Yeah, so the analogy here is that the physicists in the cocktail party just are there. And they're present.
Well, there's drinks. I mean, there's a reason to be there, probably. Maybe some music.
And as we've established, physicists apparently only either talk to other physicists, so who else are we going to be able to talk to?
Or people that know physicists.
Rarely. It's scary. The analogy is just the particle here is the famous physicist who walks into the room, and the presence of this background field makes it harder for them to move around, and we see that as mass. And then the last part of the analogy would be we actually found something that we call the Higgs boson, which is distinct from the Higgs field. And the analogy here is that if I leaned my head into the room and whispered a rumor about physics, it's a very interesting rumor that will tell everyone what papers to write or just some salacious gossip, then in this cocktail party, if you were sitting, watching this, you would see little groups of people moving through the crowd having this conversation. And so it's kind of the field itself, the background just kind of glommed together spontaneously. And that's sort of an excitation of the field.
So let me rewind and try to take another tack at mass. Okay, so you've heard of Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared, right, Greg?
I have, yes.
Essentially, it's saying that anytime you have any energy at all, it's going to have some mass, some gravitational mass. So it exerts gravity on things nearby it. It also has inertial mass. So inertial mass just says that, the heavier an object is, the slower it will accelerate. So Satchel Paige could throw a fastball, right? How fast could he throw a shot put? The shot put's so heavy that he whips it, it ends up going much slower in the end because of its higher mass. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Einstein's big idea that energy equals mass is pretty crazy. What it means is any type of energy you make has its own mass. So if you took a spring, you take a spring out of your mattress because you're a sociopath, and you squish it so that it's, almost flat. So it's almost fully compressed. And then you tape it up with tape. You've given that spring a whole bunch of potential energy. That potential energy will have mass. Suddenly the spring, minus the tape, is going to have more mass than it did before you squished it.
Yes. Now you've got a squishy spring.
So in essence, if my spring had 0 mass to start with, and I squished it, suddenly the spring would end up with mass, because I've given it energy, the energy is stuck inside the spring system, suddenly you have a massive spring. So this is another way of looking at how the Higgs field is giving mass to particles. So in essence, most of the things in the universe that have mass are stuck in some way to this Higgs field. We say the word coupled in physics, but one thing to imagine is say you have a cymbal and you want to hit it with a drumstick. Essentially, you give the cymbal some energy, it's vibrating, but there's air around it, and the air around it carries off the vibrations, it carries off the noise the cymbal makes, okay? So then we can describe this as 2 different systems that are coupled together. First, there's the cymbal head, which is its own system. It has its own physics describing how waves travel across it. And then there's the air, which has its own physics describing how waves move through it. And because the cymbal is touching the air all the time, because you make waves in the cymbal, this is going to in turn make waves that move through the air. So the idea here is that the Higgs field is stuck to everything that has mass. And what it means is anytime we want to do anything to a field that has mass, anytime we want to excite one of these weak field interaction particles, because it's stuck to the Higgs field, creating any kind of excitation in it will in turn compress the Higgs field. It will give the Higgs field a little bit of energy, and that energy is going to follow the person around and act like a mass. In essence, the Higgs field's kind of like a spring in their pocket that they're squishing down and giving them mass.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
Yes. I wonder if there might be a light at the end of this tunnel.
In what way?
Are we getting near the explanation of, we've discussed the field, which is different than the particle, and now we've discussed why mass matters.
So I think we described why the Higgs has mass, but why do we care? I think we should talk about that. Ultimately, being able to see the Higgs at CERN gives us a tool to study more about the theory.
Are you asking, like, metaphysically, why do we care about the Higgs having mass?
I'm saying we should say why it's important that our government spent all this money. I think we should address that. Ultimately, what basic knowledge we find out now about physics, we may not see the results in technology for another 100 years or something, because that happened with the electron. I mean, J.J. Thomson discovered it in 1897, and now we have iPods. That's iPhones. I mean, come on. That's pretty amazing. So who knows what we'll be able to do with what we find out now about the Higgs.
I'm a theorist. My job is to sit around and think about this stuff, and often it's hard to come up with a specific thing of what finding out about this will tell you. Will this help me build a better iPod or, a weapon of mass destruction or anything like that? And a lot of these theories, the answer is no, that we know of right now. But as you said, theories that we've worked on, a century ago or decades ago, we're now finding why they're useful. Quantum mechanics was totally, some crazy theory that no one saw ever any reason for, that it would do anything in the 1920s, and it's the fundamental basis of computers. We wouldn't be able to build a computer without a fairly full understanding of quantum mechanics. But going back to this whole thing that we started off with, we were talking about heavy particles and light particles. Things that were very long range, like photons, make it somewhat easy to build devices that we find useful. Whereas things like the W and the Z and the Higgs are really, really heavy. And so you need a lot of energy concentrated into very small regions to manipulate them. And so it's unclear right now what that will do. But if you stop looking, you'll never figure out what the answer is. And it might turn out to be something really amazing down the road. And that's sort of always the promise of working on this kind of thing.
Oh yeah, well that was fun. So thanks Matt, thanks Tia, you pleased me. Your efforts have borne fruit, and that fruit is sweet. Here's some fruit, Matthew. You get a seedless watermelon. And Tia, you get a bunch of seedless grapes.
Nom, 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 nom.
All right, I'd like to thank my guest, Greg Proops.
Thanks, everybody.
You can listen to the Proopcast. It's called The Smartest Man in the World, and it's lots of fun. Okay, suppose you want to interact with the Titanium Physicists a little bit more. If you'd like to keep track of us, why not follow us on Twitter at Titanium Physics or join our Facebook group. If you'd like to hang out with us and socialize, why not join our online forum? Or if you'd like to send me an email directly to ask a question or propose a topic, email me at barn@titaniumphysics. Let's suppose you want to listen to us more conveniently. If you've got an iPod or iPad, try subscribe to our show in the iTunes Store. While you're there, write us a review. Your reviews determine our ranking in the iTunes Store, which in turn determines how many new listeners discover our show. If you have a Zune or a BlackBerry, you can subscribe to our show using those doodads as well, or you can download the Stitcher Radio app, which will let you subscribe and listen to all your favorite podcasts. You can download the Stitcher app for free onto your iPhone, Android phone, Kindle Fire, and other devices. For all this information and more, visit our website at www.titaniumphysics.com. The Titanium Physics Podcast is a member of Bracula Media. If you've enjoyed the show, you might also enjoy Science Sort of or the weekly Wienersmith, so check them out. The intro music is by Ted Leone and the Pharmacist, and the end music is by John Vanderslice. Good day, my friends, and remember to keep science in your hearts.
Angela, don't be mad. There's something I gotta tell you, dear, before you come back here. I lost your bunny. I let him out of the cage. He was eating spring mix on the carpet, jumped through a window out into the haze, hopped down Magnolia Boulevard, no way he'll survive.
And so in the 50s? It was 50s, right? Either of you? No? Okay.
50s or 60s.
Yeah, so sometime in the 19 or 50s or 60s, they were trying to describe...
So my understanding is physics is a very inexact science. It's not important to know what decade anything occurred, or
I'm with this.
you really ballpark everything pretty much.
Well, it's not about history and dates like in
Oh, I see.
world history.
That's right.
Okay.
We have trouble remembering who did what, in fact.
Yeah, evidently, only old people watch my show, and even I know when the 50s were.
Well, yeah, that's okay.
All right, go on with your discovery here of the 60s.
So back in the caveman days,
Yeah.
they were trying to
When phones didn't talk and stuff.
they were trying to qualify why some
When if someone called your house and you weren't home, tough cheese.
that wasn't
And people wore bell bottoms.
that wasn't so long ago.
And you had to get up and turn the channel.
All right. So people were wondering why this weak
That
force.
no one bothered you, and no one Facebooked you about something that happened in their life, or put a picture of their dog up that you had to look at all of a sudden. You had to go to someone's house to see their dog picture. So yeah, it was good in a lot of ways. Trust me. And records were just as fun as downloading. You just had to play the same one over and over.
People.
So
We've even had the theory of relativity, which hasn't even been called the theory of relativity by anybody here. And I'm the only non-physicist on this program. I believe you called it a famous formula at one point, like famous Amos.
yeah, well, there's more to the theory. Calling that the theory of relativity is kind of like calling the shiny gold letters on the front of the Bible the essence of the Bible. Yeah.
Well, let's be honest about that. It is the essence of the Bible. Without the
That's the
sizzle,
only
there is
part of
no
the Bible
steak.
What a subtle thing to say. Yes, you're right. Anyway, yeah, there's more to the theory of relativity. So actually, one of the consequences.
Of course there is. He went to a party where he was dead, and all these people rushed to him. I remember.
Yeah.
And then there's just
since I represent the public in this, the great unwashed, from a cynical point of view, these discoveries in physics don't seem like as much a waste of money as just another step in the military-industrial machine of. Mm-hmm. We're often told that NASA is very important because we're discovering other planets and stuff, and it seems kind of evident that the Defense Department has a giant stake in NASA. And to take it even more cynically, it is amazing that we have iPhones and iPads, but the bitter truth of iPhones and iPads is that they're often made by people who are almost slaves, if not technically slaves, and that really the first world abuses the third world at the expense of all this luxurious technology that we have, and that to take this out even further, not only does the technology enable us to communicate with each other instantaneously, those who can afford it and those who have it, which isn't a majority of people in the world, but that also it alienates us in a sense that people don't really phone each other as much anymore. They text more. People text while they drive, which has created an insane danger on the streets of LA where I live, where no one is watching the road anymore. So there's kind of like you say, what will happen with the elements of the discovery that will be applied into some sort of practical science that we all deal with. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yeah, maybe it'll be something benign if you think an iPhone is benign, or it'll be something evil, which, since the United States is the number one supplier of guns to the entire world and armament, and is way ahead of every other country right now. And yet we keep hearing that on these debates and everything, that somehow we're going to cut the military and that's going to hurt us. So I think it's a conjectural at best to even try to estimate what the application of the Higgs boson theory is. I think it's more of a celebration for you guys because something is revealed, the goddamn particle and whatnot, that you've been striving to find for a long time. When I say you, of course, I mean you. But for the rest of us, it's a bit confusing. And like I say, from a cynical point of view, I'd like to believe that all science is benign and helpful because there's so many people who deny science right now. And that's the other, when you're talking about the glitter on the Holy Bible, there seems to be so many people in the world who don't want to believe that there's such a thing as climate change or that stem cell research is valuable or that people determine their own homosexuality and things like that. There seems to be a giant refutation of science. So I think it's important to embrace it. But it's also, I'm sure you understand, scary to a lot of people. Not just because they don't understand it, but because what can end up happening. Boy, that was a long description, but I feel like I didn't use any analogies like, say I was a sandwich eating a pancake, riding down a hill on a big wheel.
So, I mean,
Then a microwave went off, and I was wearing a hat, and Abraham Lincoln walked in. He would represent the speed of the photon. Go on, I'm sorry.
So I think that science is actually benign. It's information. It's information that we know. The problem is what happens when you get greedy people and you give them that information. They exploit it. So what
aren't most scientists working for those people?
Do is what everyone needs to do is wake up, see what knowledge is out there, and see how selfish people are exploiting that and using them.
I've got another tack on why it's valuable. We're going to speak metaphysically here. So think about the things we knew in about 1950, back in the Stone Age. We knew that there was something called gravity. People have known that since Newton. We knew that there was light and this electromagnetic force. We've known that since the 1600s, 1700s, right? Early 20th century, we discovered radioactivity. And we started firing, electrons and protons together to see what was inside of nuclei. But those discoveries, in terms of the forces that were involved in them, were fairly specific. You can't talk about the strong force or the weak force outside of an atom, because usually they don't really matter, all right? So, in essence, our day-to-day lives, we say there's light, there is gravity, there's not really anything else between us. On the other hand, the Higgs means that there's this weird field. It's like the electromagnetic field, and it's everywhere in the universe. And we had no obvious interaction with it prior to this discovery. Imagine going up to a fish. You can communicate with a fish and saying, look, fish, there's this thing called water, and you're sitting in it, and you're surrounded with it all the time. And the fish would say, who cares? What's the use? But one could argue that there's a metaphysical beauty in finding out that you're actually surrounded with this ubiquitous field For the fish, it's called water. For everything in the universe, it's called this Higgs field. And somehow, the fact that we're stuck to it in various ways, like a kid trying to run over tar paper, it's sticking to their shoes. Anytime we try to move, we're interacting with this ubiquitous field. It's aesthetically very wonderful. I mean, it's too bad that they called it the God particle, but there are lots of dumber things that they could have stuck the word God onto that made even less sense.
Uh-huh.
So, you should like it because it's wonderful.
All right. I promise to like it because it's wonderful.
You should like it because it's mind-blowing. Everywhere.
I appreciate that it's a giant leap forward in knowledge. I just, as I said, sometimes science gets scary for several reasons. And that I don't believe that people just operate in a vacuum. I think in the cynical world we live in, there's always a political reason for everything, including science, especially science. And that I think the electromagnetic field, as you spoke of, and radiation were known well before the Middle Ages. I think the ancient Greeks and ancient Egyptians would have something to say about that. What? If they could walk into a party, eating a pancake, being a spring, riding a bike.
They knew about electromagnetism. They did, in various ways. I don't think they knew too much about radioactivity, though.
Possibly not, but they certainly knew the movement of the planets and the heavens to a minute degree.
They certainly did.
And I would also say that the Indians of this continent did as well.
Yes, it's true. Gravity is arguably well understood by the Greeks and the ancients. So is electromagnetism. But here's something new. Here's some field connecting all of us. It's like a tarp that we're all standing on that we're completely unaware that we were standing on.
It's what Ian M. Banks would call the grid, if you've ever read any of his books. He writes sci-fi and he's Scottish.
Yes,
and I think he kind of anticipated that with a book called Accession, where ships are powered by the power of the grid. They don't even have an engine anymore. They just use basically the Higgs boson field and they tap into it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I would have also accepted the Force from Star Wars.
The grid better.
Oh.
The force from Star Wars is like going to a bad Northern California spa for the weekend. The philosophy is really not that. Now, on the matter of Minox on the power cable, that can be a situation.